The story's called A Fine and Pleasant Misery. Modern technology has taken most of the misery out of the outdoors. Camping is now aluminum covered, propane heated, foam padded, air conditioned, bug proofed, flip topped, disposable, and transistorized. Hardship on a modern camping trip is blowing a fuse on your electric underwear or having the battery peter out on your shaver. A major catastrophe is spending your last coin on a recorded nature talk and then discovering the Camp Comfort and Sanitation Center, featuring forest green tile floors and hot showers, has pay toilets. There are many people around nowadays who seem to appreciate the fact that a family can go on an outing without being out. But I am not one of them. Personally, I miss the old-fashioned misery of the old-fashioned camping. Young people just now starting out in camping probably have no idea that it wasn't but a couple of decades ago that people went camping expecting to be miserable. Half of the fun of camping in those days was looking forward to getting back home. When you did get back home, you prolonged the enjoyment of your trip by telling all your friends how miserable you had been. The more you talked about the miseries of life in the woods, the more you wanted to get back out there and start suffering again. Camping was a fine and pleasant misery. A source of much misery in old-fashioned camping was the campfire, a primitive contrivance since replaced by gas stoves and propane heaters. It is a well-known fact that your run-of-the-mill imbecile can casually flick on a soggy cigar butt out the car window and burn down half the national forests. The campfire, on the other hand, was a perverse thing that you could never get started when you need it the most. If you had just fallen into an icy stream or were hopping around barefoot on frosted ground, uncommon now but routine then, you could not ignite the average campfire with a bushel of dry tinder and a blowtorch. The campfire was of two basic kinds, the smudge and the inferno. The smudge was what you used when you were desperately in need of heat, but hovering over the smudge, the camper could usually manage to thaw the ice from his hands before being kippered to death. If the smudge did burst into a decent blaze, there was no such thing as warming up gradually. One moment the ice on your pants would show slight signs of melting, and the next your hair on your legs would start going up in smoke. Many's the time I've been a blue and shivering man hunched over a crackling blaze, suddenly eject from his boots and pants with a loud yell and go bounding down in the snow. The front half of him the color of boiled lobster, and the back half still blue. The inferno was what you always used for cooking. Experts on camp cooking claimed you're supposed to cook over something called a bed of glowing coals. But what everyone cooked over was the inferno. The bed of glowing coals was a fiction concocted by the experts on camp cooking. Nevertheless, the camp cook was frequently pictured by artists who should have known better as a tranquil man hunkered down by a bed of glowing coals, turning plump trout in the frying pan with the blade of his hunting knife. In reality, the camp cook was a wildly distraught individual who charged through the waves of heat and speared savagely with a long sharp stick at a burning hunk of meat he had tossed on the grill from a distance of 20 feet. The rollicking old fireside songs originated in the efforts of the other campers to drown out the language of the cook and prevent it from reaching the ears of little children. Meat roasted over the campfire was either raw or extra well done, but the cook usually came out medium rare. The smoke from the campfire always blew directly into the eyes of the campers, regardless of wind direction. No one minded much since it prevented you from seeing what you were eating. If a bite of food showed no signs of struggle, you considered it a reasonable indication that it came from a cook pot and was not something just passing through. Aluminum foil was not used much in those days, and potatoes were simply thrown naked into the glowing coals, which were assumed to lie somewhere at the base of the inferno. After about an hour, the spuds were raked out with a long stick. Most of the potatoes would be black and hard as rocks, and some of them would be rocks. But it didn't make much a difference either way. Successive layers of charcoal would be cracked off until a white core of potato was uncovered, usually the size of a walnut or maybe a pea. This would be raw. Sometimes there would be no white core at all, and these potatoes were said to be cooked through. Either that or they were rocks. There were other fine sources of camping misery besides campfires. One of the finest was the old-fashioned bedroll. No matter how well you tucked in the edges of the bedroll, it always managed to spring a leak in the middle of the night. A wide assortment of crawly creatures, driven by a blast of cold air, would stream in through the leak. Efforts to close the gap merely opened new leaks, and finally you just gave up and lay there, passing the time until sunrise, approximately 37 hours, by counting off insects one by one as they froze to death on your quivering flesh. My bedroll, made from my grandmother's patchwork quilts, was an oven compared to my first sleeping bag I ever spent the night in. My inconsistent boyhood companion, Stoop Jones, told me one September day that I would not need my bedroll on our outgoing night because he had discovered an honest-to-goodness sleeping bag in the attic of his house and was big enough for both of us to sleep in. Now when I say that what a compact little package a real sleeping bag could be folded up into, I become immediately ashamed of my own cumbersome bedroll, which I rolled up into the bundle the size of a bale of hay. I was glad that I had not marred the aesthetics of our little camping trip by toting the gross thing along. That night, we spread the sleeping bag out on a sandy beach alongside Sand Creek. Stripped down to our shorts, we had both been taught never to sleep with our clothes on, and hopped into the bag. The effect was much like plunging through thin ice into a lake. Not wishing to insult my friend or his sleeping bag, I stifled a shrill outcry with a long, deep gasp disguised in turn as a yawn. Stoop said through chattering teeth, the sleeping bag was bound to warm up, since it was, after all, a sleeping bag, wasn't it? The two lovers ever clung to each other with such tenacity as did those two 8-year-old boys. No two lovers have ever clung to each other with such tenacity as did those two 8-year-old boys through the interminable night. Later we discovered, with some sleeping bags, come in two parts. One a nice padded liner and the other a thin canvas cover. What we had was the latter. One of the finest misery-producing camping trips I have ever been on occurred when I was about 14. 3 friends and I were hiking to a lake up the Idaho Rockies. What had been a poor drizzle when we had left home worked its way up and became a highly successful blizzard in the mountains. Before long, our climbing boots, called tennis shoes, were more prosperous parts of the world, were caked with ice. The trail was slowly being erased before our very eyes. I was beginning to write new stories in my head. The futile search of 4 young campers lost in a snowstorm has been called off. As we clawed our way up the side of the mountain, one of the frailer souls, never ask me who, suggested the better part of the valor, or even of stark madness, might be to turn back. But he was shouted down with such cries as, "When I come this far to fish, I'm going to fish," and "Who knows which way is back?" Eventually, we come to a tiny cabin of a trapper who had either been a midget or had crawled around on his knees all day, for the structure was only 4 feet from the dirt floor to the log ceiling. We tidied the place up by evicting a dead porcupine, split up enough wood to last a month, and started a fire in a little makeshift stove. The stovepipe was a foot short of the roof and resulted in a minor inconvenience of having the roof catch fire every once in a while, but nobody really minded. You like it? One second day, Kenny and I fought our way up the lake. We carried out his vow to fish, and we stumbled back to the cabin. We stripped off our sopping clothes and sat down side by side on the woodpile next to the stove, whose glowing pipe was sending out soothing waves of heat from the flames, howling up through it. Now, as was our practice in these days, we had carried enough grub for us to feed a regiment of lumberjacks for a week of full-time eating at Norm. A rather plump kid decided to take the edge off his boredom by shooting baskets with the excess of hard-boiled eggs he had discovered. The opening at the top of the stovepipe served as the basket. Kenny and I watched in fascinating horror, as they say, as one of the rim shots lodged on the edge of the glowing pipe, and the whole contraption began to topple toward our naked laps. Now, both of us worked on a sizable amount of activity, but because of the cramped quarters, it was insufficient to move us clear of the descending pipe. In order to avoid incurrence and potentially worse damage of our anatomies, we caught the stovepipe with our hands. For 2 or 3 hundredths of a second, we passed the glowing cylinder back and forth between us, all the while calmly contemplating the best course of action. Since neither one of us could manage to accumulate enough free time or leverage to get up from the woodpile, it at last occurred to us to simply drop the pipe on the floor. Both of us wondering why we hadn't thought of such an obvious solution sooner. At the time, it seemed that we had juggled the stovepipe for approximately 2 hours, but in retrospect, I doubt the total time was more than half a second. Smoke, true to his nature, had in the meantime filled the cabin to overflowing, and the 4 of us rolled out through a tiny door hole as a single choking ball of adolescent humanity. The storm outside, particularly to those not wearing any clothes, was refreshing and seemed to call for some strenuous exercise. What followed, as Vern remarked later, was something you don't see every day. 2 naked, enraged people chasing an hysterical fat kid up the side of a mountain in the middle of a blizzard. In terms of misery, that camping trip was very fine. I once launched my family on a program designed to toughen them up, on an assumption that the more misery they could endure, the more they would enjoy hunting, fishing, and camping. Whether anyone skinned a knee or thumped his crazy bone, he was to reply in answer to inquiries about the extent of his pain, a mere detail. Thus my children were expected to ignore the minor miseries encountered in the acquisition of outdoor knowledge and experience, and to make little of mosquito bites, burned fingers, and vast assortments of natural projections known as stickers. As it turned out, though, I had to abandon the program. One day, on a family camping trip, I picked up a large branch for firewood and discovered an outlaw band of yellow jackets awaiting an ambush. A running battle ensued. I finally outdistanced the little devils, as I call them, but not before several of them had inflicted some terrible wounds on various parts of my person. My family watched as I flitted like a nymph through the woods, careering off of boulders and leaping mammoth moss-covered logs. Fortunately, my wife said later, most of my shouts were inaudible, and the children were saved from traumas that might have wrought physical havoc. When I finally lunged back into camp, still wearing and snarling, my littlest girls consoled me with the words, "Details, Daddy, mere details." When I decided right then and there, if a kid can't distinguish between real pain and little old skin knee, then I had better call off the whole program. And that is what I did. I mean, you don't want your children to grow up to be totally insensitive. By camping, misery is a thing of the past. Like most of my fellow outdoorsmen, having gathered into a camper the fruits of technology, I am protected from cold by propane, from hardness by foam rubber, and from insect world by a bug bomb. Still, sometimes I have a nostalgic yearning for some of that old-fashioned misery. And it came to me that what we need nowadays is a misery kit. I think it would find a market, especially among older campers, who might enjoy a bit of instant misery on the camping trip, so they would have something to tell folks about at home. There could be an aerosol can for spraying a blast of cold air down your back every once in a while. Another spray for spraying smoke for in your eyes. There might be a pair of refrigerator boots you could stick your feet into for a few minutes each morning. A rock or spine or pine cone could be included for slipping under the fitted sheet of a camper bunk. Everyone, of course, would want a pre-charged spud. There might even be a box of mixed insects, yellow jackets, mosquitoes, ticks, jiggers, and deer flies. Maybe that would be carrying misery a bit far.